Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of AIJAC Live Online. My name is Joel Burney, and it's fantastic to have you with us today. Special mention to our Facebook audience and our international guests who have been able to join us this afternoon. It's great to have you with us. Now, as usual, ladies and gentlemen, a quick announcement on our next webinar. It's my pleasure to be able to announce that our next webinar will be with the Moroccan ambassador to Australia, His Excellency Karim Medrek. Ambassador Medrek will present to us next Thursday afternoon at 12:30 p.m. An invitation will hit your inbox later on this afternoon. As usual, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be also conducting a moderated Q&A session during today's webinar. I'll go through the instructions as to how to use the raised hand feature inside Zoom later on in today's webinar. Now, ladies and gentlemen, to our main event, it's my pleasure to introduce Behnam Ben Taleblu, who is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy in Washington, D.C., where he focuses on Iranian security and political issues. Behnam previously served as a research fellow and senior Iran analyst at FDD. Prior to his time at FDD, Behnam worked on non-proliferation issues at an arms control think tank in Washington. Leveraging his subject matter expertise and native Farsi skills, Behnam has closely tracked a wide range of Iran-related topics, including nuclear non-proliferation, ballistic missiles, sanctions, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the foreign and security policy of the Islamic Republic, and internal Iranian politics. His analysis has been quoted in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Reuters, Fox News, the Associated Press, and AFP, amongst others. Additionally, he has contributed to or co-authored articles for Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Fox News, The Hill, War on the Rocks, The National Interest, and US News and World Report. Behnam has appeared on a variety of broadcast programs, including BBC News, Fox News, CBS Interactive, C-SPAN, and Defense News. Behnam earned his MA in International Relations from the University of Chicago and his BA in International Affairs and Middle East Studies from the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to announce today's topic is Iran. Is there a plan B? I would now like to hand over to AIJAC's Executive Director, Dr. Colin Rubenstein, to say a few words.
Thanks very much, Joel. Pleased to welcome you all today, as we will be pleased to welcome you next week, next Thursday, November 4, that is, with Moroccan Ambassador Karim Medrek. But it's a particular honor today to have our distinguished guest of honor, Behnam Ben Taleblu, with us. Behnam, as Joel has said, is a senior fellow at the highly prestigious FDD. He's going to address, of course, the very pressing issue of whether Iran, as it sprints towards nuclear threshold capability and status. Now, we don't know how close it is, and we're not even sure what that really means, but we do know it's a very worrying situation. We do know that they have a new administration in Iran, new very hardline President Raisi, and that we have in Washington the Biden presidency and administration grappling with Iran after their initial promise to go back into the JCPOA and then get a better deal. That seems not to be working out so well, with the Iranians increasingly, seemingly even taunting the United States, the Europeans without much leverage, and the IAEA even losing their ability to monitor much of Iran's nuclear program. We also see Iran more than dabbling with its malign hand across the Middle East in the major tragedy debacle, which is Beirut and Lebanon, with a Hezbollah and Iranian involvement there. It's a close relationship and support of Hamas in Gaza, as well as elsewhere across the region. And we've seen the consequences of the fiasco of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, and what are the implications of that, and what are the implications for Iran's approach in general. And Iran, more explicit than ever in terms of its determination to destroy Israel as its clear goal, and clearly upsetting and worrying the whole Arab Sunni world. And on the other hand, we see the Abraham Accords getting even more traction and hopefully more significance going forward. What's Israel's option in all of this? What's the attitude of Russia? Not too happy with the Iranian presence in Syria, quite obviously. And very important, I think, for the region, for Australians in particular, what's China doing in the Middle East, and what's it doing in terms of propping up and emboldening Iran in particular in a whole range of trade and non-trade ties. So to address all these questions, who better than our guest today? Behnam is the analyst to help shed light on all of these pressing issues and many, many more. Many of us got to know Behnam much better during his AIJAC-sponsored trip to Australia a couple of years ago, where he impressed so many people, and I know many are very eager to hear his thoughts on these questions today. We read you regularly, Behnam, and we watch you on the best TV shows going, so we keenly await your insights today. The screen is yours. Welcome, Behnam.
Thank you both so much for that very kind and warm introduction. As you mentioned, Colin, it was about 2 years ago this time where I got to know most, if not all, of the AIJAC team. I want to give a special thank you and a special shout out to everyone who I got to meet and everyone whose work I follow from this side, no matter how big or how small. Colin, Joel, Svi, Jeremy, Sharon, Ovid, Helen, and plus, of course, Mark and Paul for their support and their leadership. Thank you all for doing what you do. It is noticed. It is noticed more than halfway around the world. And thank you all for this very kind and warm introduction. I will do my best to rise to the challenge of the litany of questions and scenarios and situations that Colin painted. Sadly, it is a very accurate depiction of the multiple challenges. It's kind of like a cook who has 5 or 6 burners on all at once. For the Biden administration with respect to the Iranian challenge. It's not just the nuclear challenge, it's not just the regional challenge, it's not just the dynamics of the Arab states and the Israelis in the aftermath of the withdrawal from the botched withdrawal, we should say, from Afghanistan, America's longest war. It's a lot more than that. And the biggest thing you hear about in relation to all of these things, this thread connecting everything, is the talk of a plan B. You heard this talk of a plan B when the new Israeli government was formed, and the new Israeli government actually came to Washington. There were high-level meetings. You heard talks about agreements over a plan B. You heard talks about Washington agreeing to a plan B in principle. But I'd like to stress, one man's plan B, one person's plan B is not like another. And my fear, my ultimate fear, is that what we spoke about a year ago this time, about the differences between the Republicans and the Democrats on Iran, about the centrality of the JCPOA to the Iran debate in Washington versus the increasing lack of interest in the JCPOA and the lack of centrality to it in the debate in Tehran is sadly coming to fruition. You basically have a dynamic right now where in Washington you have a government that is very keen on de-escalation and pivoting out of the region. And in Iran right now, you have a constellation of ultra hardliners at the helm who are very comfortable with escalation and want to make it look like, as Iran's new ultra hardline president, Ibrahim Raisi, said in his virtual and televised United Nations General Assembly address just last month, they want to make it look like America has not exited the region, but has been kicked out of the region. I'm paraphrasing from his speech there. He was speaking about Iraq and Afghanistan. Ultimately, right now, you have a competition in risk-taking, but a competition where the Iranians definitely feel they have the advantage, and they definitely feel that they are comfortable with steps 2, 3, and 4 on the chessboard. I think the biggest intellectual challenge facing the Biden administration is that it's staffed with individuals who actually believe that the predecessor, meaning the maximum pressure policy of their predecessor, former President Trump, did not work, was futile, has backfired, and has actually cost America. And that explains the different phases of U.S. policy towards Iran that we saw. And I fear that we have a 3-part phase already going. Phase 1 from January, when the Biden administration came in, until April, when indirect diplomacy commenced between the outgoing Rouhani administration in Iran and the Biden administration in Washington, you basically had the government in Washington talking about getting a longer and stronger deal, something better than the JCPOA, building on the JCPOA. That was their rhetoric, but in principle and in practice, what you saw the administration do is try to distance itself very much from the pressure policy it inherited from its predecessor. So delisting terrorist organizations like the Houthis from the terrorist organization list the Trump administration had actually put there, trying to kind of publicly denigrate the Saudis, draw some distance there between the US and one of its key regional partners, given the longevity and the humanitarian crisis on full display with the war in Yemen. Try to develop a new response ratio to Iran-backed escalation by Shiite militias in Syria and Iraq, and inadvertently absorbing more escalation therein. At the same time, of course, the administration loosened some of the restrictions that existed for Iranian diplomats that are associated with the United Nations in New York City, and ultimately turned a blind eye for a very long time to oil exports that, not curiously, picked up at the end of 2020, a few weeks after the election was called, the presidential election was called by the Chinese. And these oil exports had been growing in 2020 and in early 2021 and represent a change of calculus, a change in market dynamics, and a change in risk tolerance by the single biggest importer, licit and illicit, of Iranian oil, from the Obama-era sanctions to the Trump-era sanctions to the Biden era, and that is the People's Republic of China. Chinese cash has helped the regime stay afloat and has helped pay for Iranian intransigence at the negotiating table from April to July, when the Rouhani administration was at the helm, and pay for Iranian intransigence away from the negotiating table from August to present, which is when the new ultra-hardline government of Ibrahim Raisi has come to the fore. And this is quite the achievement, even by Iranian standards, or I should say the standards of the Islamic Republic, that the government of Ibrahim Raisi, his presidential cabinet, his administration, his vice presidencies, is the most internationally sanctioned cabinet in the history of the Islamic Republic. There are people whom the Europeans and the Brits have sanctioned that the Americans have not. There are people that the Americans have sanctioned that the Brits have not. It's an entire trade-off of sanctioned individuals subject to who have conducted human rights abuses, who are weapons of mass destruction proliferators, who are illicit financiers, who are appointed to their position simply by virtue of being close to the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, being close to his network inside the country. So there's a litany of these ultra hardliners at the helm. And this constellation is very comfortable with their escalation options, as I've mentioned before, and does not believe that all this talk of a plan B that you've heard really since late August 2021 is actually going to ever materialize. And they do have some data on their side. They may be ultra hardliners, they may be zealots, they may be revolutionaries, but they're able to look at 2021 and realize that in phase one, as the Biden administration wanted to get the Iranians to the table, it tried to distance itself from the Trump era sanctions it inherited. In phase two, once the indirect diplomacy commenced from April to June, July of 2021, all that talk about getting a bigger and better deal, about getting a stronger and longer deal, fell. The US did not talk about that. Aim number 1, 2, and 3 became getting the JCPOA back at all costs. So once the Iranians realized that, and realized that Washington was looking at the outgoing Rouhani administration as a closing window of opportunity to resurrect this fatally flawed and fast expiring deal, they were able to once again play their good cop and play their bad cop. And unfortunately, I think Washington fell for it. And in this instance, when the Raisi government came in, they realized how desperately Washington wanted a deal. And they're trying to see how serious Washington is about this talk of a plan B. And so far, their answer is clearly not that serious. You've had a couple of enforcement actions from the Treasury Department, some of which have been important because they signal there's a potential change in direction. There has been some tightening of the oil sanctions, but ultimately this illicit shipment of crude and petroleum products to East Asia, and the Treasury Department specifically says East Asia because it doesn't even call out China specifically, but anyone who's looked at the data can tell you where these ships are heading and why they're heading there and who the likely customer actually is here, knows that it's the Chinese that are keeping the Islamic Republic afloat. And ultimately, when you have this dynamic, the regime is inclined to take more and more risks. So the regime, rather than be censured at the International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors meeting, has actually thrice avoided censure. And this is the price floor. This is the de minimum diplomatic pressure that you can begin to wield against the Islamic Republic before you can move to things like snapping back those older UN Security Council resolutions against Iran at the Security Council, collapsing that 2015 nuclear deal known as the JCPOA, bringing back multilateral pressure, and then working with European partners to get a multilateral pressure campaign going against the Islamic Republic. This is really the minimum thing. And the way that the Biden administration has treated, even holding Iran accountable for its gross nuclear advances, and we can begin to dissect some of those momentarily, is that if it begins to use pressure in a sustained fashion against the Islamic republics, it believes that it will be closing the door to diplomacy. They haven't said this formally, but that's the implication of their actions, that the two tracks don't actually proceed in a parallel fashion, apace towards one another, that they have to signal that they have some capability to do these sanctions, hence some of those symbolic moves by Treasury earlier this summer and earlier this fall. But ultimately, the goal is to show an earnestness, a zealousness, you could say, for diplomacy, to keep this door open, because they believe that rather than have pressure support diplomacy, pressure would be an impediment for diplomacy. This means that they have not learned the lessons of 2010 to 2013, which is really the incubation phase, both for the toughest of US penalties on Iran that are on the books, but not necessarily being enforced well right now, as well, of course, the multilateral penalties that existed from the European Council then, which were built off the backs of much tougher UN Security Council resolutions that were much tougher than that which we have in place today. So ultimately, Tehran is creating crises, testing the will of the international community to support the International Atomic Energy Agency. You have not only lack of access to sites, you have not only unresolved questions about undeclared nuclear material from well over a year ago, information that the agency was able to follow up on thanks to the atomic archive that Israel seized and exposed, showing Iran's long-standing nuclear weapons aspirations that were not fully detailed by the IAEA, and aspirations about what a crash program for a nuclear bomb could look like, ultimately. And worse than that, the Iranians are even able to scot-free harass the physical inspectors themselves. You saw stories from earlier this year about the Islamic Republic actually harassing, not just impeding access to facilities, but harassing female IAEA inspectors inside Iran. The regime is just doubling down on violation after violation, gross action after gross action, because it knows many of these things will come off scot-free. And as the regime is doing this, it actually is building out more and more capability. While we've talked about, Biden moving from Plan A diplomacy to potentially Plan B pressure, it's important to understand what is the Islamic Republic's game and state of play with respect to its program here. Because ultimately, while there has been a very significant change in US policy on Iran from Trump to Biden, there has not been a significant change in Iranian policy from Rouhani to Raisi. And that's because the most important player is someone who we just briefly mentioned before, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. And Supreme Leader in that country is a title meant to be taken somewhat more literally than it may be taken here when the name sometimes comes across in the press. But ultimately, Iran had a three-part plan in response to the US withdrawal from the JCPOA in 2018, and also in response to more pressure and bringing its violations into the limelight. For the first year, from 2018 to 2019, the Islamic Republic's policy was to absorb as much economic pressure as the US was going to be throwing at it, because it did not believe, much like many in Washington did not believe, that the unilateral pressure policy of former President Trump would be as effective in record time as the multilateral sanctions had been, which started back in 2006 at the Security Council. Once they saw the stunning success of that policy, success that you can literally measure through the macroeconomic contraction, GDP, inflation, stagflation, value of the rial relative to the dollar, and lots of other metrics, declining oil numbers, things of that nature, the regime commenced the policy of graduated escalation, designed to step up this competition and risk-taking, as scholars say, and ultimately try to escalate along 5 fronts: the nuclear domain, the missile domain, the military/regional domain, basically support for terrorism and support for proxies, the maritime domain, with all the stuff that we saw the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz and with the tankers, and also in the cyber domain, particularly in the cyber shadow war against Israel. Its goal was to try to generate more risks to throw off the US sanctions policy. And when the US sanctions policy was not thrown off, in 2020, mid to late 2020, the regime commenced its third part of its policy. So it went from strategic patience to graduated escalation to significant escalation. And ultimately, what it did is begin to add significant redundancy to its nuclear program. Redundancy that creates more risk, means more machines, means changing the calculations about a potential Iranian nuclear breakout, means stockpiling and enriching more uranium on its soil, but also doing things that are inherently more provocative. And into January 2021, Iran announced that it was resuming enrichment of uranium to 20% purity. 20% is technically considered highly enriched, and then a nation that can go from 0 to 20 can go from 20 to 93%. And 93% is ideal weapons grade, though countries have used somewhat below that in the past. Then further on this year, the regime actually went to 60% enriched uranium. The regime has been threatening to go to 60% enriched uranium, something that some countries use for the propulsion of nuclear submarines. Even though the regime only has diesel electric submarines, it's flirted with the idea, it's talked publicly about the idea about getting, developing, having nuclear powered submarines. And under this pretense, as well as continued fuel fabrication, has enriched to 60%, something the knowledge of which is essentially irreversible. Coupled with the phasing in of advanced centrifuges that can enrich more in less time and actually require less machines and a smaller footprint to actually have a higher output. And ultimately the production of uranium metal, which despite Iran's faux civilian claim, many believe actually has no legitimate civilian claim and is actually a hint, hint, nudge, nudge sign of Iranian interest in potential weaponization of this nuclear program down the line, means that in 2021, the Islamic Republic of Iran has been making irreversible nuclear gains. Irreversible nuclear gains at the same time that the administration in Washington continues to talk about a closing window, a closing door, a diminishing runway, ending patience, and now most recently, a critical stage for potential resumption of diplomacy vis-a-vis the Islamic Republic. And every time Washington talks like this, but acts in a very different fashion, the Iranians are actually incentivized to escalate further. And we are getting quite close to the point, and I think the Israelis understand this, and I think some US regional partners in the Middle East also understand this, that perhaps the Iranians aren't just interested in developing these new nuclear facts on the ground as bargaining chips for sanctions relief. Yes, they still need sanctions relief. If you look at their economy, even the sanctions that are not being enforced vigorously still have an outsized macroeconomic impact. We have to give the Biden administration credit where credit is due. But ultimately, it may tempt Tehran, coupled with the withdrawal in Afghanistan, coupled with the administration's inclination for absorption of military pressure by Iran-backed militias in places like Syria and places like Iraq, coupled with the distance between America and some of its more traditional partners in the region like Saudi Arabia, that Iran can, through a series of lightning moves, begin to evict America from the region. And perhaps this will tempt Iran to move further and further and further down the line with respect to its nuclear program. Just this month, just this October, the sanctioned head, I should say, of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, Mr. Islami, came out and said that the regime has stockpiled ahead of a parliamentary mandate that was issued in December 2020 after the killing of Iran's chief nuclear scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh Mahabadi, that Iran should stockpile upwards of 120 kilograms of uranium enriched at 20% purity. The regime claims it has now actually done that. This constant touting of new nuclear facts on the ground is designed to add to the drip, drip, drip of suspense that the Biden administration is facing, and designed to put America and the international community to a choice about how to act to best address this. And while you've seen somewhat remarkable Israeli success with respect to pushback in places like Syria, there are still open questions given the centrality of the nuclear threat to both America and Israel and other actors as to how the Biden administration is going to square the circle about Iran's increased comfortability with this sort of nuclear expansion, a nuclear expansion that they're keen to both use for extortion purposes as well as for learning purposes. Because lest we forget, since 2002, the Iranians have been working. It's like building a plane and flying it at the same time. I think that's a apt analogy about how to develop a civilian veneer for their nuclear program. But lest we forget, their nuclear program was resurrected amid the bloody 1980-1988 Iran-Iraq war. This wasn't a science fair experiment that the regime resurrected. It resurrected this in the quest for the ultimate deterrent. It resurrected this program at the same time that it worked to procure and produce ballistic missiles that could one day be tipped with this sort of weapon, with the ultimate deterrent. When you see the Iranians learn from their history and overlearn the lessons of past wars with the Israelis, you get things exactly like what you had with the most recent Gaza war, the flare up there this May, and that protracted conflict where Iran is not just proliferating whole systems anymore to its terrorist proxies and partners, it is helping them produce things domestically to stop the success of the Israeli mission of counter-proliferation along Iran's land bridge. So the regime has larger military motives. It believes that America is on its way out, and it's doing things across those 5 domains that we mentioned in the aims of ultimately kicking the US out of the region, having a freer hand, and working to develop this ultimate nuclear deterrent. If I can end with one paraphrase quote from the chief of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Aerospace Force. This quote made its way into the Persian language press, I believe, the same day that Iran's president Raisi was delivering his virtual address to the UN General Assembly. The IRGC Aerospace Force commander, Hajizadeh is his last name, had actually been giving an interview to an Arabic language outlet. I believe it was an outlet affiliated with Lebanese Hezbollah. And at the top of the Persian translation of the highlights of that interview is a phrase that I want you to remember, because again, all of these moves are interconnected. Iran doesn't have an arms control policy, then it has a totally separate regional policy. These things are all interconnected, and they're all threats that are intentionally being elevated today. Hajizadeh told that outlet that the day Soleimani was killed, Iran made a pact to evict America from the region. Now, Iran has always, under the auspices of the Islamic Republic, tried to force foreign forces out of the Middle East so they could have a clearer pathway for hegemony, so that its regional adversaries could have no foreign backstop, so there would be no balancing coalitions emerging. They had not counted on a couple of American-owned goals in 2021. I think we've seen the detriment of some of those own goals, and I think it's imperative for U.S. policy to try to course correct as quickly as possible, because the Iranians are intent on this eviction.
Thank you for that, Behnam. Fascinating presentation there, ladies and gentlemen. The reaction button you will see on your Zoom screen, you can hit that button use the raised hand feature. That will provide me with a silent notification of your intent to ask Behnam a question. You can also write a question in the chat feature if you would like. However, it's better for everyone if we can see everyone's faces and you can ask Behnam the question directly. To kick us off today, I'll hand over to Dr. Zwiefleischer.
Hi, Behnam. Thank you, as always, for that very detailed and insightful presentation. My question is about the IAEA. We know it's lost a lot of its ability to monitor what Iran's doing on the nuclear side. Can we trust what it says about its measurements of how much uranium Iran has of various sorts and the things it's doing? And is it even in a position to tell us if Iran tries to break out of a nuclear breakout or a nuclear sneak out to actually build a bomb, or we don't have that information anymore?
So the International Atomic Energy Agency, led by Director General Rafael Grossi, who was recently in Washington, gave a couple of very good interviews that I recommend the audience to watch. In particular, there was one by NBC, and I think there were a couple of quotes he gave to a different think tank known as the Stimson Center, where he really put plainly the challenges that he faces. Ultimately, they're using incomplete information because the Iranians have been able to create monitoring and verification crises, because the Iranians have been able to get away with now for over a year not answering or not responding fully to questions about undeclared traces of man-made uranium at different sites in the past. And really, since February, there's been an attack on the additional protocol, which gives the IAEA some further muscle for monitoring inside that country, but inside any country that has an additional protocol that is active. And Iran has actually been able to reduce the IAEA's footprint when it comes to some site visits, reduce their visibility when it comes to actually even servicing cameras in places where they may not be visiting. And then worse, and most recently, when it came to a centrifuge production facility on the outskirts of Tehran, in a suburb of Tehran called Karaj, they're not even able to service some of those machines or properly get the video that the cameras had actually been procuring on time, had actually been filming on time. So ultimately, this means that there is a lot of potential for gaps in IAEA reportage. It still is really the best public source of information, but the Iranians are gradually appear to be confident that they can begin to phase the IAEA out of some sites. And right now you've had, in 2021, I should say, you've had 3 different instances at the Board of Governors meetings where Washington and its international partners could have cited this slow, steady gutting of the monitoring and verification regime between the Islamic Republic and the IAEA, cite that as a problem, coupled with its mounting nuclear violations, and of course, coupled with other additional protocol issues, an issue of resolution censuring the Islamic Republic. But every time the Islamic Republic has either been able to invite Grossi to Iran or have some kind of diplomatic side agreement or pretend to save or keep the door open for diplomacy last minute and avoid a resolution of censure. And that's happened thrice this year. There is one more Board of Governors meeting coming up in November. And I guarantee you Tehran may try to erect and sustain a whole new monitoring and verification crisis. But the IAEA has been quite plain about the lack of access that it has, about the impediments Iran's behavior has caused, about the real monitoring and verification challenges with respect to Iran's nuclear program. And ultimately, lest we forget, this sort of monitoring, this sort of verification, whether it's of enrichment sites or centrifuge production facilities or other nuclear sites, vis-a-vis the Iranians and the IAEA, are of declared sites. But lest we forget, many of these declared sites were once undeclared sites. So that question of, does the Islamic Republic still have undeclared sites or new nuclear sites that are undeclared? That question should always be lingering in the back of your head, given the past 2 decades of history between Iran and the IAEA. So there is a lot of cause for concern in the questions you raise. It is a very good picture compared to everything else, but it is a highly, highly, highly imperfect picture, and one that the Iranians are very keen on slowly, strategically blurring to cause risk, blurring to cause fear, blurring to ultimately force the international community back into, again, this fast expiring nuclear deal for the ultimate purpose of winning sanctions relief.
Thank you, Behnam. I'll now hand over to AIJAC's Naomi Levine.
Thank you very much, Behnam, and good to see you again. My question goes to a bit of a different topic, and that's Iran's hostage diplomacy. Australia was lucky enough to be able to do a deal for Kylie Moore-Gilbert, who was our most high-profile hostage in Iran, but there remain Australians imprisoned in Iran, and obviously there are a lot of other foreign nationals or dual nationals imprisoned in Iran as well. Could you tell us whether there's any movement in trying to bargain for any of these hostages, whether the new Iranian regime is still intent on using hostage diplomacy as a tool, and what more we can do to stop this really despicable human rights violation?
You know, most unfortunately, I think the Islamic Republic is not only keen on using hostage diplomacy as a tool of its broader foreign and security policy, but it's keen on, again, using and abusing and weaponizing both dual citizens as well as foreign nationals when it gets the opportunity as bargaining chips and as pawns in its larger game of strategic competition with X country or Y country. Ultimately, it's doing this for a strategic purpose. I learned a lot firsthand about Iran's hostage diplomacy by talking to and having the pleasure of actually writing a recent article with a former hostage in Evin prison, Wang Shuye, who was formerly at the American Enterprise Institute and is a PhD candidate, I believe, at Princeton University. I believe he was held hostage in Iran for something close to 40 months when he was conducting field work. So most unfortunately, I don't think this is a trend that the Islamic Republic has given up on. It's actually really one of the earliest and most consistent trends you've seen in the revolutionary regime's behavior really since 1979. It really divorced itself from that relationship with America from the 444-day hostage crisis from 1979 to 1981. Moving forward, you have people inside Iran, such as the Foreign Minister Abdullahian saying recently to the UN Secretary General that Iran sees the hostage issue and the nuclear diplomacy issue as separate. There was earlier reporting this year, perhaps mistaken reporting, that the Iranians had assumed that the Americans saw them as linked. Let's hope that there isn't again some sort of these covered swaps where, again, if it looks like a duck, if it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, then it's a duck, where you had the $1.7 billion exchange in exchange for several American and other foreign national and dual national hostages released in January 2016, because ultimately it's that sort of behavior that tells the Islamic Republic it's okay to keep taking more and more and more of these hostages. And I remember I was in Australia, I think, when the story about a former Australian hostage who thankfully is now at Kylie Moore Gilbert. Her case was really sad, very, very tough to follow. But the Islamic Republic sadly intent on continuing, I think, down this path, which is why it retains many of these hostages still. And again, we should call them hostages. It's not someone who's unfairly detained or unjustly detained. These people are hostages inside the Islamic Republic. And the foreign and security policies of the countries that have lost their hostages, that have had their citizens turn into hostages, needs to reflect that change. And I think putting their names in bright lights, putting names in spotlights, and making sure it's always part of the discussion with the Islamic Republic is step number one.
Thank you, Behnam. I'll now hand over to Ovid Lebel.
Hey, Behnam. Good to see you again.
Likewise, thank you.
So I just wanted to ask, if Iran does decide, well, first of all, would Iran decide to build a nuclear weapon once it had enough enriched uranium? And if it did, how would its behavior change? And since it's impossible not to feel echoes of Pakistan, is it conceivable that Iran already has the bomb?
All very good questions. I think that the Pakistan analogy is very apt if you look at something between Pakistan and India, like the Kargil crisis from the late 1990s, after Pakistan had detonated. Some countries can think that they have immunity once they test a weapon or declare that they have all the pieces of a weapon in place. This is really one of the ultimate fears when it comes to the Islamic Republic. It's not the immediate use it fear, even though there is a large body of statements by officials, military officials, political officials, religious officials, even in the Islamic Republic, talking about their enmity towards some of their neighbors, particularly singling out the Jewish state, and of course the 4 decades of foreign and security policy by the Islamic Republic, where they've done everything to try to attack the Jewish state with a death by 1,000 cuts approach. So one has to necessarily wonder when, from the very early days, they write "Death to Israel" on these missiles, don't they actually just mean it? So that is something that always has to be part of the debate, particularly from the regional context when looking at Iran's nuclear aspirations. So one, the big fear is that ultimately, if they get this sort of weapon, they will feel deterred. 2, of course, is what it means for the foreign and security policy vis-a-vis Israel. And I think 3, to get back to the heart of your question, that if Iran were to do this, I think we have to go into history, and we don't even need to go into South Asian history. We can go into Iranian history, which is, lest we forget, one of the big lessons of the Atomic Archive is that the regime actually had a crash program. We like to think of Khamenei as much more slow, much more deliberate, much more slow-paced than Pakistan or North Korea when it came to their weapons aspirations and their weapons programs. But once you look at some of this material and you look at Iran's work, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, before 2002, before 2003, the regime actually had a crash program for what is reported to be up to 5 nuclear weapons. So the idea of Iran wanting to move back into the weaponization space, wanting to move into the secret nuclear weapons development space, is not theoretical. What is theoretical is this debate that has happened in the public since 2002, that Iran's nuclear program is explicitly civilian, has to be proven as being nuclear. No, it was resurrected amid a war. It had costs that were sustained. There is documentary evidence of it wanting to go towards a crash program. It got caught. It went public, it reoriented, and it developed a civilian rationale. And Washington continues to debate over the limits of the civilian rationale, but it should never forget that there was an intention and the strategic context in the mind of the leaders of the Islamic Republic to actually move towards that weapons capability has not changed. And to put the pieces together of the US leaving the region, of the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, of the perception that Washington is a paper tiger, of the changes in the nature of the political relationship between Washington and some of its regional partners, Iran may feel that the situation is not what it was in 2002 when it had the US Army on its eastern flank and it was about to get it on its western flank. And later on, once it got it on its western flank, it saw the US actually decimate the army in a record number of weeks that the Islamic Republic had fought to a bitter stalemate for a period of 8 years in a conflict that saw a generation of Iranian leaders rise to prominence, and a conflict that they call the holy defense or the sacred defense. So ultimately, I think the regime still has its eyes on the prize. One reason that they had wanted the JCPOA, of course, is that it was merely a small off-ramp, a delay in their path for a nuclear weapon, but something that would never impede them to getting it in the end. So deal or no deal, I think the regime has those intentions in place. And if it acts this way when it has missiles that it touts can strike Israel, if it does more risk-tolerant things now, imagine the sorts of risks the regime will run when it feels it has the safety of a nuclear umbrella under it. And that is what I fear the most.
Thank you for that, Behnam. I'll now hand over to AIJAC's Aaron Shapiro.
Yes, hello, thank you. I'm curious about your observations in Lebanon. We've seen some street fighting recently. There's an element in Lebanon which is very anti-Hezbollah that's becoming more vocal. But meanwhile, Hezbollah has militarized southern Lebanon to such an extent that it's a key element in their strategy in case of an Israeli strike on their nuclear facilities. So do you see any developments in Lebanon that could either throw a wrench into Iran's plans vis-a-vis Hezbollah, or is this just, or is Hezbollah actually going to capitalize even more on the situation in Lebanon?
I mean, I think things are quite fluid in Lebanon still, where it's hard to come down decisively a yes or no in that question. But, I think the premise of your question is totally right, that Iran is keeping, both eyes on the situation on the ground there, because Lebanon is really home to the most successful proxy of the Islamic Republic, Hezbollah. And it's a model that Iran has tried to replicate in many other places. And it is a militia group that has been active on Iran's behalf in at least 2 or 3 other theaters across the Arab world: Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and it's even helped other militias get training inside Iran. These are things that documents from 2007, 2008 helped reveal. The documents about what became pro-Iran Shia militias in Iraq then. The Lebanese Hezbollah had a significant outsized role in training them on Iranian territory and being something of a go-between between the Iraqi militias and the Iranian IRGC commanders and other military officials. So it has this perpetual political and strategic utility. But the military utility that you mentioned is one reason why Iran can't have the situation in Lebanon escalate too far. If you remember, there were street protests in 2019, both in Iraq and in Lebanon, that had Iran quite on edge. Protests actually within the Shiite communities there, but not limited to the Shiite community. And to get to the military component of your question, the regime uses Lebanon, much like a former colleague of mine, John Hanna, had compared Hezbollah to in Lebanon as the conventional artillery of North Korea, where North Korea may have a nuclear weapon, but it also has this conventional artillery that can strike Seoul. So Iran was trying to use, and in fact has successfully used, Lebanese Hezbollah today to create, in the words of this scholar and several others, a North Korea, South Korea kind of situation, where if you try to go towards a strategic threat and take out the nuclear centers, then the conventional threat would come bearing down, and vice versa. And this is a very difficult position to be in. But I think Iran, again, learning the lessons of history, what the Islamic Republic is pursuing, in my view, with this rocket proliferation, precision-guided munition proliferation, still financial and political support and material support to Lebanese Hezbollah and other militias and terror groups, is to actually act on this quote by former President Sadat of Egypt when he started the 1973 war. And we just passed the recent anniversary of that war earlier this October. And Sadat had said in the very early phases of that conflict that he wanted to, quote, prove that the Israeli theory of security would collapse. Put differently, he was fighting a more limited war, and he had limited war aims. And ultimately, he was trying to land a blow against the Israelis. And what the Iranians have done as the interstate conflict period has ended, and you had the intifadas and the armed, train, and equip missions, and the tightening of ties with Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the arming of Hezbollah and the rearming of Hezbollah after 2006, is to create multiple situations like that on multiple fronts for the Israelis. And every conflict, 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021, have to again and again and again force the Israelis into a different fighting posture and learn about the capabilities the Israelis have, as well as how to fight better and longer. So it is a very, very tough position for the Israelis in the Levant right now. And it is made tougher by this long-standing political and material support that Iran gives Hezbollah. And ultimately, this support is sustained and in fact has grown. You could say, even though some of the numbers have shrunk, but support has grown because of the prominence of Hezbollah within the Lebanese government. So in that sense, an Iranian fuel delivery to Lebanon to Lebanon can actually be a fuel delivery to Lebanese Hezbollah. Efforts to keep the Lebanese state afloat can be akin to keeping parts of Lebanese Hezbollah afloat. So it's a very creative, very tough situation the Islamic Republic has created there in the north of Israel.
Thank you for that, Behnam. I'll now hand over to AIJAC's Judy Maynard.
Yes, hi. Can you tell us something about internal dissent in Iran? Are the dissenters likely to have any impact on the regime, on its behaviour, or even bring about regime change?
One of the most interesting periods to look at dissent in Iran was the past few years, 2017 to 2020. And me and my colleagues have actually done a study on this and as to why the massive protests, many of which were triggered by economic grievances, but were sustained by larger political grievances, were interesting to watch. And they were interesting because they broke away geographically, demographically, in terms of slogans from past periods of protest where they were really tied to a particular element of the Iranian system. 1999, 2009, it really is part of the end of the politics of the reform movement, where 1999 triggered by the closure of Reformist newspaper and attack of Tehran University's campus. And then ultimately, you had 2009, the stolen election in favor of Ahmadinejad and the crackdown of the Green Movement and street protests that ensued then. Those were things triggered by certain political events. But now with the triggering of these protests by economic events, but sustained by larger political grievances, you have Iranians coming out into the streets saying, this one slogan is "Eslah talab usulgara dige tamam majera," which is reformist, principlist, the jig is up. Meaning that the street protests that you've seen from 2017 up until present are actually pushing past reform and actively coveting revolution. And in that sense, they actually have in their crosshairs the regime's foreign and security policy. Another slogan is Surya raha kon fikri bima kon, forget Syria, think about us. It's actually a quest for a fundamentally different foreign and security policy inside Tehran. And you look at the past century of protests in Iran, it's been about a century of social, economic, political, and religious protests about state versus society. And you actually have a very, very, very significant chasm again today in the Islamic Republic, a chasm between state and society, which means that those protests are likely to continue. Now, in fact, it'll be a little bit harder to continue because the regime certainly has a monopoly on violence and has used that monopoly on violence using literal weapons of war against their population. We're coming up now on the anniversary of the November or the Aban protests from 2019, where the regime killed, I think, upwards of 1,500 people in the days that it actually had shut down the internet for 6 or 7 days. And those were really nationwide protests. The regime, I think, is not afraid to use that kind of those weapons of war again. And that's the really, really, really scary thing. But also looking at the strength of the Iranian people, they came out this summer. That tells you there will be more protests moving down in the future. This time was triggered by environmental as well as some ethnic grievances inside the country, but sustained, unified by larger political distaste in the way things are going in Tehran. And yes, the government inside Iran today is more hardline than before, is more cohesive than before, but they're drawing on a narrower bench of elites than ever before, which means that chasm that we talked about between state and society is very wide and will one day come to a head.
Thank you, Behnam. I'll now take the opportunity to take the only question in chat. I'll quickly paraphrase it for you, Behnam, but essentially, with Americans showing some signs of a declining empire and empires not really recovering when or if they are in such a decline, with the US or seeming US withdrawal from certain parts of the Middle East, including the Arab Peninsula, are the Iranians wrong in their calculation that American power in the region is declining? And if it is, and if they are withdrawing, who's going to fill that vacuum?
Well, I have a lot of concerns about this. I think that the timeline for this withdrawal may be a bit overstated, but I think Afghanistan is very fresh on everyone's minds, and the Iranians are very keen to solidify that impression. So ultimately, Washington has to learn here one of the major lessons of the Cold War, which is that if the Cold War was really cold between the US and the USSR on their own territories, it was really only cold because it was hot in a lot of other territories. And the Middle East is one of those areas where if Washington is going to pick up on this trend of great power competition or pivot to Asia that existed respectively under the Trump and under the Obama presidencies, and now follow through with that under Biden, basically saying, in effect, the Middle East is a junk bond and East Asia is the next major domain, make or break domain for strategy and strategists, then it actually means investing still in the Middle East, because who do you think is going to be filling those vacuums? The Russians and the Chinese. Ultimately, they'll be able to empower American adversaries to do exactly what you don't want, which is to give the impression that you're being kicked out of a region rather than leaving a region. And Washington needs to actually be able to balance this, discussion of all in or all out. There are certainly ways to have a lighter footprint. Syria is a place where there is definitely still an economy of force mission compared to, I think, an invasion like Iraq or Afghanistan at their early peak. But ultimately, the writer or the individual who raised this question is thinking strategically like the Iranians, which is, if America is on its way out, why don't you push them further? And this is the kind of things that the regime in Tehran is actually debating today. And it's the kind of thinking that underwrites more escalation in Iraq. And it's the kind of thinking that actually underwrites Iran's diplomatic overtures to countries in the GCC, countries in the Gulf Cooperation Council. You've seen a lot of reports this year about direct and bilateral diplomacy between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I think the US has even welcomed that. On the surface, yeah, that's good if adversaries talk, but what's driving this? What's driving this, I fear, is a perception by Saudi Arabia that Washington no longer has its back, and the Iranians, acting on a quote from former commander of the IRGC Quds Force, Qasem Soleimani, in 2010, who, when he was talking to Iraqis, and this is a quote that became public in 2013, he said, "We're not like the Americans, we don't abandon our friends." And the Iranian impression, and I guarantee you their talking point when they go and they make the round in the region, is that America is on its way out, so best to cut a deal with a rising Iran and accommodate Iran. And that's really the worst of all worlds for our friends and our allies in the region to be in.
Thank you, Behnam. I'll now hand over to Dr. Ranparat.
Hi, Behnam. Good to hear from you. Two questions. One is if you can elaborate about the negotiation strategies the Iranians are using, sort of Persian bazaar. For instance, what they're doing with the Europeans, talking to them directly and not talking to the Americans directly. And where does the attack on the Tanaf base in southern Syria by the Iranians, where does that go into the negotiation strategy of the Iranians?
So let's start with the second question, because I think it ties neatly into the first, and it helps to disprove something. And it disproves, in my view, this lens that the administration here in Washington has adopted, which is that the nuclear and the regional are totally disconnected. That is really not the case. While yes, Iran has battlefield, tactical, geostrategical considerations for the drone attacks that it's doing, essentially it basically responding to things, creating new dynamics on the ground, fighting the wars with its proxies that it has fought really for over a decade now in places like Syria and Iraq. Ultimately, these moves are not divorced from the bigger picture, which is why they have military and battlefield utility for the Islamic Republic. Because remember, Tanf sits in a very, very, very strategic location in southeastern Syria. It's basically preventing the Iranians from actualizing one of their roads to actually develop this thing called a land corridor or land bridge that allows Iran to ferry men, money, and munitions on land rather than via air from Iran to Iraq to Syria into Lebanon. It's part of a critical, geography as politics component for Iranian strategy. The US still occupies that. The Iranians are signaling resolve that they have the interest as well as the capability to be able to contest that in the future. But this resolve should not be limited, or it should not be interpreted as being limited. This is resolve that the Iranians are saying that they have that also exists at the negotiating table. Because if they ever do go back into negotiations, they want you to know that they have a strong hand in the region. And Washington made this mistake before. In 2013 and 2015, basically sacrificed, intervention in the Syrian conflict on the altar of, getting the JCPOA vis-a-vis the Iranians, and ultimately sustaining the JCPOA after 2015, 2016. I think that was a strategic mistake. If you're looking to signal resolve to your adversaries, you do so in multiple theaters where they have interests. And if you don't want to signal resolve to your adversaries, well, you're going to be paying the cost for that in places where you're engaging your adversaries, which is the nuclear negotiating table. So ultimately, I think Iran, if it ever does come back into talks, and it is quite possible that it does, but not likely in the very short term, Iran is looking to build on these regional gains, particularly after we'll see what happens with US forces in Iraq after December, where there's a change in mission of the US force there. If, of course, there are more drone attacks, you saw drone attacks in places like northern Iraq starting this April by Iran-backed Shia militias, where drones basically function as a poor man's cruise missile. They're suicide drones or kamikaze drones going into not just facilities where US forces or coalition forces are, but allegedly where there's a CIA hangar and where there's capabilities perhaps that the Iranians may be targeting. Who knows? But it shows a shifting calculus, it shows a risk tolerance, it shows a resolve, and the Iranians want that impression of resolve to be taken from the battlefield in places like Iraq and places like Syria and be conferred to the negotiating table. So they want to both win on the battlefield and win on the negotiating table. And what they're doing right now is building up their leverage, but also providing themselves with options and seeing how we respond to those options. Does Washington absorb escalation in Iraq differently than it does in Syria? These are open questions for the Iranians. They're literally studying this. It's a gigantic social science experiment, you could say, vis-a-vis the IAEA and Iran. What is the material point when the US will be forced to go back into a sanctions regime? What is the political point when the E3 censures Iran more actively? What is the political point when a resolution of censure will be passed against the Iranians? What is the political point when the international community will rally to the defense of the IAEA? Iran is testing all of these things. So it's escalation in the region, particularly with what you mentioned vis-a-vis Tanf, but also, of course, I would look to Iraq as well. And also, we can't forget about Yemen. there are all of these places where Iran is testing red lines. But again, regional, missile, maritime, cyber, and of course, nuclear. So these are the areas I would expect to see increased escalation moving forward.
Thank you, Behnam. I'll now hand over to Jamie Hymes for the penultimate question.
Thank you, Joel. Thanks very much, Behnam. I'm just wondering, in an ideal world now, how would you like to see the US and its JCPOA allies react to what Iran's doing now? What actually should it do? And if that plan B that we've referred to involves a military attack on Iranian nuclear facilities as a last resort, how do you expect from the US or from Israel or from both, how do you expect Iran would react to that? Thanks.
Well, I feel that as if Washington is quite far away from even discussions of a shared or a joint strike on these facilities. And that's in some ways good news because it has a lot of room for improvement on every other kind of capability that it needs to develop vis-a-vis the Iranians. There's a lot of room for improvement on diplomacy. There's a lot of room for improvement on informational operations. There's a lot of room for improvement on economics and financial sanctions. And there's a lot of room for improvement on the military card against Iran in the region. Because again, if you're trying to send a signal of resolve, you do it at the region so that message of resolve is conferred to other theaters. So ultimately, I think the course that Washington is headed in is incorrect, which is the resurrect the JCPOA approach. But if it is that course that they're going to be continuing on, and if they're going to be continuing to center their Iran policy around the JCPOA, which is a mistake, there are things that I say is the least that you should do. And it actually allows them to pivot away from this JCPOA all or nothing approach. And the least that you could do is as follows. And it's first commence a diplomatic pressure policy against the Islamic Republic. And step one means this November at the IAEA Board of Governors, a resolution of censure at the Islamic Republic. Step two is working with the European partners, these partners who have over a year ago triggered the dispute resolution mechanism at the Joint Commission, which is a body created by the JCPOA nuclear deal to address implementation and other concerns related to the deal. Check in on the status of that, have a special meeting about Iran's mounting and somewhat irreversible nuclear transgressions, nuclear violations, and nuclear advances. And through the Joint Commission process, commence the process to actually kick back Iran's nuclear file from the IAEA Board of Governors to the UN Security Council. And using the snapback mechanism, which is one of the few good things in the JCPOA, because it has, you could say, a reverse engineered veto mechanism, commence the process to collapse UN Resolution 2231 and bring back the 5 or 6 resolutions that existed that presented a united multilateral basis for pressure against the Islamic Republic and did not have arbitrary timelines of things like prohibitions on Iranian weapons transfers or arbitrary timelines on things like Iranian ballistic missile testing, for instance. Then you could actually improve on that resolution based on Iranian behavior and adjust for new threats, perhaps adding in cruise missiles, perhaps adding in ways to hold Iran accountable into a potentially new resolution, and then working to develop a united economic pressure policy on the back of the collapsed UN Resolution 2231 and the resurrected UN Security Council resolutions. This is a de minimis approach, coupled with, of course, something tougher on the economic side, which is continue the pace of sanctions that existed before. When you look at late fall 2020 and even early 2021, there was a fairly rapid clip of designations coming out of the Treasury Department, holding the regime accountable, human rights abuses, terrorism, missile testing, missile proliferation. And again, using all of those authorities to continue to signal to the regime that its nuclear and non-nuclear threats will be equally taken into account. And then, of course, using the bulk of the sanctions time and the bulk of the sanctions attention and the bulk of the sanctions leverage on punishing, cracking down on the sale, supply, transfer, and even illicit storage of oil, to crack down on those revenues that's helping Iran have the money to say no and to thumb its nose at negotiations. At the same time, you can actually commence talks with your regional partners, talk about what having a regional approach to countering Iran could look like. There is a new task force the Biden administration created, if I'm not mistaken. It's Task Force 59. It's basically drone-centric. Look to get regional countries as part of Task Force 59. Look to build on areas that the Iranians have expressed weakness or concerns about. One major area, of course, is continuing to grow out the Abraham Accords. I think it was just recently that Khamenei, the country's supreme leader, had chastised those countries that had normalized or were normalizing relations with the Israelis, and he was telling them to change course. Something Washington can do is to double down, to add to the impression that the regime is surrounded. And again, as we get close to that second anniversary of the Aban protests, never be afraid to do the right thing, and never be afraid to do the right thing, especially when it is actually in concert with, rather than conflicting with, your moral imperatives and your strategic imperatives, which is to stand up for the Iranian people at every time they take to the streets. So that's a de minimis approach that doesn't even require talking about military options. I think another thing is to make sure Israel has a free, if not freer hand in Syria, to make sure all the forces, all the assets, all the interests that the US has on the other side of the Persian Gulf are protected, that there is in fact working towards a connection between air and missile defense assets among all the GCC countries and among the infrastructure that Washington has on that side. These are, again, all de minimis things. We can go on and on and on. Not withdrawing from Iraq would be another. Actually having an Iraq policy that is not just a counter-ISIS policy or not just a counter-Iran policy would be another too. There's plenty to discuss, but this is all really a de minimis, which is IAEA Board of Governors resolution, Joint Commission meeting, snapback UN Security Council resolutions. This is the de minimis, and this is proof. If Washington doesn't do this, then it's proof that it doesn't have a plan B.
Thank you, Behnam. And now for the final question for today's webinar, I'll hand over to AIJAC's Jeremy Jones.
Thank you, Behnam. We in Australia are very concerned with Iran's behaviour internally and externally. In recent times, there's been intensification of campaigns on behalf of the Baha'i community in Iran, Christians in Iran, prisoners, other victims of the regime. I'm wondering if those public campaigns you feel are having any effect even on public opinion in a way that would frame better attitudes towards Iran. But also, Australia wants to know, what can we be doing better diplomatically and politically to stop Iranian ambitions, particularly those, but not only those, which directly threaten Australia's interests?
So there's certainly a lot there. Right? I understand the inclination of some US partners and allies not wanting to get ahead of Washington on big picture things like the nuclear issue. But there is certainly a niche to carve out on things like Iranian missile testing, Iranian missile proliferation, the Iranian drone threat, helping to develop a more connected multilateral export control system to crack down on technologies that empower the regime's drones could be a small niche area that Australia or any country could be doing more on. I think leading the way when it comes to continuing the tide of designations against Hezbollah is something that I think the Australians could pick up on and actually do in concert with some of their Five Eyes partners, the UK, the United States, most obviously, who already have designated Hezbollah in its entirety and dispense with this fiction that Iran's chief proxy has a military wing and a political wing. It's as if we forget the origin story and the evolution of Iran's chief proxy every time we do use that window dressing of political wing versus military wing. And then, of course, to put the stories of individuals, again, on the moral side, like Kylie Moore-Gilbert, in bright headlights, to talk about what happened, to talk about the successes and failures of countries in the past that have tried to get hostages out of Iran, and to actually learn from some of those mistakes. And one country that still has foreign citizens or dual nationals inside Iran, and I believe Australia does qualify, can actually become the mantle for efforts to actually shine a light on those individuals, on their stories, without actually having to engage in some kind of Faustian bargain with the regime. Because what the regime loves to do, particularly in the American context, is to take hostages and actually work to get agents of proliferation who have actually gone through the US justice system off the books in these exchanges in the past.
Thank you very much for that, Behnam. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have time for today. On behalf of everyone at AIJAC, thank you so much, Behnam, for such a fascinating webinar today. It's good to see you virtually, and let's hope that we get to see each other face-to-face sooner rather than later. As I said at the top of the webinar, our next webinar invitation will hit your inbox sometime later on the afternoon. That's with Moroccan Ambassador to Australia, His Excellency Ambassador Medrek, and that will be on Thursday, 4 November at 12:30 p.m. Until then, stay safe and we look forward to seeing you then.